Today's stories are about three of the most infamous serial killers in history. One captured decades after his crimes, another whose cryptic messages still haunt investigators, and a third who preyed on victims for years while hiding in plain sight. These cases will leave you questioning everything. But before we get into them, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in story format, then you're in the right place. That's all we do, and we upload daily. So, if that's your thing, be sure to subscribe and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Alright, let's get into today's stories. It was a warm Sacramento night in 1976, the kind where neighbors felt safe leaving windows open, trusting the quiet suburban streets and the familiar faces around them. But on this night, an eerie quiet blanketed the neighborhood, a stillness that felt unnatural, like a held breath. Inside her home, Marie Sanderson settled into bed, exhausted from a busy day. She'd felt the slight autumn breeze drift through her open window and let it lull her to sleep, secure in her well-lit neighborhood. But just past midnight, a sound pulled her from sleep. It was soft, barely noticeable. At first, it sounded like a creak, maybe the settling of her house. She brushed it off, eyes heavy with sleep. Then came a distinct rustling, and suddenly Marie was fully awake, her heart pounding as she strained to hear. In the darkness, she saw a shadow move across her bedroom. A shape, a man, was inside her room. She froze, praying it was a trick of her mind. But the shape moved closer, and she felt the ice of realization sink in. Her breathing quickened as she tried to stay silent, hoping this figure would pass by and disappear. But the man stepped closer until he was at her bedside, his face obscured, his breath slow and measured. The neighborhood would later be torn apart by this attack, and then by the others that soon followed, as this figure slipped unseen from one home to the next. The police were called, and residents put up lights, locked doors, and told each other to stay alert. But the intruder didn't stop. The attacks became more frequent, and each time, he became bolder, his pattern more complex, his strikes precise, calculated. Within months, an entire community was in a grip of fear. Sacramento's streets felt haunted by a predator whose reach seemed impossible to evade. Police held community meetings, trying to reassure the residents while the suspect remained a shadow, always a step ahead. Investigators worked around the clock, tracing every lead, interviewing neighbors, and circling his footprints without ever catching his face. Meanwhile, the intruder's tactics were growing darker. Where he had first taken small valuables, he began entering homes with more dangerous intentions. By now, he had earned a terrifying nickname, the East Area Rapist. The police and media reported on his crimes, listing neighborhood after neighborhood, each report bringing only frustration, only terror. It was as if the man wore invisibility, his every move elusive. The authorities launched sweeping efforts. Surveillance, staked out neighborhoods, detectives posted in unmarked cars. All eyes were on him, and yet each time, he slipped through. Homes in Sacramento became fortresses as residents fortified their doors, added security lights, anything to keep out the faceless intruder. People whispered about the man, saying he seemed like a ghost. Detectives knew this wasn't a specter. It was a real person, a person skilled at hiding, skilled at masking who he was. Late one evening, just as it felt like the case was slipping from their grasp, the police received a frantic 911 call. It was another woman, her voice trembling, her breath shallow, describing what had happened. This time, she'd been home alone, asleep, when she woke to see the figure watching her, barely visible in the dim light. The details followed the same haunting pattern. He had entered silently, watched her as she lay there. She described the terror of feeling trapped, alone, and completely at his mercy. But this time, the woman saw something, enough of his face to offer details, something that police could use. Law enforcement felt the flicker of hope, but it was barely enough to go on. They placed her description in their growing profile, filled with chilling fragments of evidence, and hoped it might be enough to narrow their suspect list. But the lead stalled. Once again, the trail went cold, the neighborhood locked in a vice of fear. As weeks turned into months, and as seasons changed, the attacker's violence grew with each strike. Every incident was calculated and deliberate, like he was refining his skills. And each time, he vanished as quickly as he'd appeared, leaving behind nothing but broken doors, empty homes, and the memory of a shadow lingering in the dark. One evening, the police received another call. This time, the man had broken into a home, armed and violent. His victim, a mother home alone, described the terror that gripped her as she lay awake, unable to make a sound. He bound her hands, her feet, and left her terrified as he moved around her house, stealing small items and leaving his mark of fear. The detectives began to think this wasn't simply a criminal. This was someone with a hunger for terror itself. The East Area Rapist, as he was called, moved across Sacramento and into nearby cities, slipping into homes as if doors and walls were transparent. Each home he entered felt like a violation, a reminder that no lock, no barricade, no alarm could stop him. Neighbors kept their doors locked and lights on, but it didn't matter. The predator was still there, somewhere, watching. And the attacks spread. Now it wasn't only Sacramento that lived in fear. Nearby towns became his targets, and each town felt his grip tighten. The East Area Rapist had become an epidemic, a faceless horror, and no one knew who or where he was. Police profiles described him as methodical, relentless, and impossible to pin down. Residents became hyper-vigilant, while detectives tried to decipher his patterns, catching only scattered glimpses of his violent tracks. The cases multiplied, spreading like a nightmare. Each home he entered bore silent witness to his chilling presence. A broken lock, a discarded flashlight, faint marks left on walls and windows. But still, police could do nothing. They kept watching, kept listening, but he was always ahead, always out of reach. Years would pass before authorities would know this predator's real name. For now, he was an unknown, a nameless terror stalking homes under the cover of night, leaving communities scarred and restless. They could only wait, locked in the knowledge that he was out there, somewhere, waiting for his next victim, lurking in the shadows, a terror made flesh. As the months passed, the East Area Rapist's methods shifted from mere intimidation to outright aggression. He escalated, moving with a chilling confidence. What once might have been his thrill of watching people sleep, of entering unnoticed, had evolved. He was no longer content with simply lurking. Now his intent seemed to grow darker, more brutal, and Sacramento's fear deepened with each new incident. It was late one evening when he struck again, this time in a home on a quiet street lined with trees and families. His approach had become methodical. He took time to watch each house, to study his potential victims, to learn their routines. He knew when they went to sleep, when the lights turned off, when silence settled over their homes. And once he chose his mark, nothing would stop him. This particular night was dark, the sky covered in a heavy layer of clouds. A couple lay sleeping in their bedroom, unaware that someone had been watching them. They had no idea that, over the past days, their every move had been tracked by a stranger. Silently, he slipped in through a window he'd pried open, his flashlight casting a narrow beam that landed softly on the floor. He moved like a shadow, barely making a sound, yet with each step, his intentions grew clearer. He moved down the hallway, entering the couple's bedroom without so much as a whisper of sound. The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open in a haze of sleep. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but then she saw the figure at the foot of her bed. Her heart pounded, fear freezing her limbs, and she struggled to understand what she was seeing. But it was too late. He stepped forward, commanding her to be silent, and the terror that gripped her was indescribable. The next moments unfolded in a blur as he bound her hands and feet, making sure she could not escape. The man who had once been content to steal in silence now seemed to relish the power he held over others. He tied her husband too, his movements swift and precise, ensuring they were completely at his mercy. He loomed over them, his breath steady, eyes cold and detached. Then, without warning, he slipped away, leaving them bound and terrified, their cries for help stifled. The couple lay in silence, paralyzed by shock, waiting for any sound that would tell them he was gone. When the police arrived, they found the home in disarray, but there were few traces of the man who'd been there, only the faint echo of fear he left behind. News of the attack rippled through the community, adding fuel to the fire of terror that was now consuming California. By now, the East Area Rapist's reputation was known far beyond Sacramento. His reach extended across cities, leaving detectives desperate for leads and communities on edge. Each new attack bore the same unsettling signature, a cold precision, a controlled violence, and a terrifying unpredictability. He was no longer just a criminal. He had become a legend of fear, a figure that haunted California's quiet suburbs and shattered any illusion of safety. The task force investigating the crimes had grown, and with it, their sense of urgency. Detectives pored over every detail, hoping to find any mistake, any clue that might reveal the man behind the mask. They mapped his attacks, combed through his victims' statements, and analyzed the patterns of his movements, all in the hopes of understanding how he operated. But each time they thought they were getting closer, he would slip away, leaving them with nothing but the chilling aftermath. He moved quickly, sometimes striking twice in a single week. His routine grew more twisted, each incident darker than the last. The rapist now targeted homes he knew would be occupied, families he knew were together, adding layers of terror to his crime. Investigators noted that he seemed to anticipate their moves. They could only guess that he was listening, watching news reports, carefully studying their progress. He was always one step ahead, maneuvering like someone who knew the law and the people who enforced it. As his attacks intensified, whispers began to spread that he might have had training, perhaps even experience in law enforcement. The thought was almost unthinkable, but as detectives reviewed his techniques, it became harder to dismiss. The police advised citizens to lock their doors, double-check their windows, and stay vigilant. But even that didn't ease the community's fear. Every doorbell, every creak, every passing shadow felt like a warning that he was close, watching, waiting. Parents walked their children to school, kept them inside at night, and tried to explain, without shattering their innocence, why they had to stay safe. The newspapers started calling him the Night Stalker, and the name quickly took hold. His attacks spread like a dark tide, moving from Sacramento down into other parts of California, and each city felt the same weight of fear. Police departments shared information, pooling resources to create a profile of the man who had eluded them for so long. His planning, his precision, and the way he left almost no evidence behind. It all pointed to someone who knew exactly how to avoid capture. Detectives felt as if they were chasing a ghost, a man who seemed to slip in and out of their grasp with a terrifying ease. One summer evening, he struck again. This time, he entered a home where a young couple had just settled down for the night. They were used to leaving their windows open, letting the night air cool their home, but they hadn't heard about the recent attacks. They didn't know the shadow that had been moving silently through the streets. The man entered without hesitation, his steps silent as he approached the bedroom where the couple lay asleep. When they woke to find him standing there, the terror was immediate, and they quickly found themselves tied, helpless, their pleas for mercy met with cold silence. The aftermath was swift and devastating. The police arrived, questioning neighbors, checking every lock and every window, but finding nothing. All they had were the terrified statements of the victims and the sense of dread that seemed to cling to the walls. The Night Stalker had vanished once again, leaving no trail, no trace of where he'd gone. Detectives worked tirelessly, searching for anything that might reveal his identity, but each lead turned cold. Each clue led them nowhere. He seemed to be a master at erasing his tracks, at blending into the darkness he left behind. For those investigating the case, the frustration was palpable. They were faced with a man who was nearly invisible, a predator whose methods defied every strategy they knew. They combed through every detail, every whisper, every faint lead, knowing that somewhere out there he was watching. They could almost feel his presence, as if he were taunting them, daring them to find him. The detectives were relentless, but the fear grew with each passing night, each empty lead. And the communities he had terrorized were left to wonder who he was, where he would strike next, and if he would ever be stopped. By the early 1980s, the Night Stalker had left California reeling from his attacks. But the name itself soon faded, as police uncovered that he had shifted his violence to another part of the state. He would later be known as the Golden State Killer, but by this time, he had already left a lasting scar on California's towns and cities. His movements were calculated, deliberate. He targeted suburban neighborhoods, the kind of places people moved to for safety and a sense of peace. But he was changing, adapting his methods to throw the police off his trail, transforming into something even darker and more relentless. His attacks became unpredictable, moving farther south and spreading his terror to a new region. His brutality was escalating, his methods growing more terrifying with each break-in. each calculated act that left his victims in utter shock. This time, he struck in Los Angeles, a sprawling city where anonymity was easier to maintain. Here, he found ways to blend into the chaos, to disappear into the background noise. The police in Southern California were faced with a new wave of violent crimes, and their efforts to track this predator stretched their resources thin. The attacks he carried out there were unlike anything the communities had ever seen, and his sudden appearance shattered any sense of security residents had clung to. Detectives from Sacramento and nearby counties worked alongside their Southern California counterparts, comparing evidence, pooling resources, and studying his patterns. What they found was disturbing. His methods showed an eerie understanding of police procedures, as if he knew precisely how to avoid detection. The way he entered homes, the careful steps he took to cover his tracks, and the precision with which he committed his crimes all pointed to a familiarity with law enforcement tactics. It led investigators to believe that this man may have had a background in policing or the military. It was a chilling thought that someone trained to protect the public might be the very one terrorizing them. His new name, the original Night Stalker, was a label that barely captured the horror he left in his wake. In this new chapter of his spree, he no longer just targeted individuals or couples. His attacks now involved entire families, a shocking escalation that felt almost unimaginable. The man who had once broken into homes to frighten and intimidate was now committing acts that were far more violent, leaving behind crime scenes that would haunt even seasoned detectives. The police were desperate to stop him. Task forces were formed, meetings were held, and new strategies were implemented, but each time, he seemed to slip through the cracks. The investigators became haunted by the details of his crimes, and the frustration of being unable to capture him gnawed at them day and night. They knew they were up against someone with a meticulous mind, someone who anticipated their moves and stayed one step ahead. But the Golden State Killer seemed unstoppable. As he moved from one city to the next, he left no clues, no fingerprints, nothing that could lead investigators to his identity. He would vanish as quickly as he appeared, leaving only the horror and devastation of his crimes in his wake. And while police continued their search, the people of California lived in a constant state of fear, knowing he was still out there. Some of the investigators on the case, seasoned as they were, began to feel the psychological toll of this hunt. They spent their days and nights chasing someone who always slipped away, like a shadow just beyond reach. His attacks had no discernible pattern, no predictable timing, making their job even harder. All they had were the terrified accounts of survivors and the horrifying scenes he left behind. The frustration, the long nights, the endless attempts to connect the dots, it wore on them. Some officers were pulled off the case, only to be replaced by others equally determined to bring him to justice. As time passed, a grim acceptance settled in. They were up against someone who seemed nearly impossible to catch, a man who could slip in and out of the most secure homes without leaving a trace. And so, as the years dragged on, a silence began to settle over the case, a sense that he might never be found. For the communities he had terrorized, the passing years did little to dull the fear. People spoke of the Night Stalker and the Golden State Killer in whispers, still haunted by the memory of his crimes. Each city he had passed through held a dark memory of him, a reminder that no matter how safe they felt, there was always the shadow of a predator who had once walked among them. Years passed, and the case of the Golden State Killer began to fade from the headlines, but he was never forgotten. His last known attack had been in 1986, and for reasons no one understood, he seemed to vanish. The communities he had once terrorized breathed a collective sigh of relief, though they knew he was still out there somewhere, hidden among them. For the detectives, the Golden State Killer became a cold case, one of the most painful they had ever worked. The psychological toll lingered, and many investigators retired with the weight of his crimes etched in their memories. They had spent years chasing him, following every lead, analyzing every piece of evidence, but it was as if he had disappeared into thin air. Despite their efforts, the mystery of his identity remained. Then, in the late 1990s, DNA analysis started to advance in ways that had once seemed like science fiction. The technology allowed detectives to examine biological evidence in new, precise ways, connecting fragments of data that had previously seemed unrelated. Cold case detectives across the country began to reopen unsolved cases, and California was no exception. Among those files lay the evidence from the Golden State Killer's spree, the countless samples that had been carefully preserved in the hope that one day they might lead to answers. In 2001, investigators made a discovery that would change the course of the case. DNA from one of the Golden State Killer's crimes matched DNA from a separate series of unsolved cases. It was an unmistakable connection, one that revealed the horrifying scope of his crimes and showed that he had terrorized communities beyond what investigators had originally known. This finding reignited interest in the case, sparking renewed determination among detectives who had once thought they would never see justice served. Years turned into decades, and the trail remained cold, but advances in genetic research continued. Investigators held on to a slim hope that one day, DNA could provide them with more than a match. They wanted a name. And then, in 2018, a groundbreaking technique emerged: genetic genealogy. The approach used DNA data from public genealogy databases, linking genetic material from crime scenes to potential relatives of suspects. This technique had already helped solve other cold cases, but using it for a case as complex as the Golden State Killers was a daunting challenge. Investigators pushed forward, tracing the Golden State Killer's DNA through distant relatives, meticulously mapping out family trees, narrowing down potential suspects. Finally, after countless hours of research, a name surfaced: Joseph James DeAngelo. It was a name that meant nothing to the public, but struck a chord of horror in the detectives who had pursued this man for decades. Joseph DeAngelo was living quietly in Citrus Heights, California, a short drive from many of his old crime scenes. He had been hiding in plain sight, blending seamlessly into the community he had once terrorized. DeAngelo was an ex-police officer, a detail that confirmed the suspicions investigators had long held about the Golden State Killer's knowledge of law enforcement tactics. In April 2018, a team of officers assembled to arrest him. They knew they had to act carefully. DeAngelo was older now, but he was still a man with a violent past. The team waited for the right moment, and when he stepped outside his home, they closed in. Decades of fear, pain, and unanswered questions had finally led to this moment, and the man who had once seemed untouchable was now in custody. For the survivors, for the families, and for the detectives who had worked tirelessly on the case, DeAngelo's arrest was a long-awaited relief. Joseph James DeAngelo was in custody, but for the victims, the journey toward closure had just begun. After years of fear, loss, and unanswered questions, DeAngelo's arrest was a moment of reckoning. Survivors and families of his victims gathered, determined to see justice finally served. DeAngelo was formally charged with multiple counts of murder and other serious crimes tied to the attacks that had plagued California in the 1970s and 1980s. The court proceedings were monumental, drawing attention from around the world. After hiding for decades, DeAngelo was now face to face with those he had terrorized, his identity laid bare. Those who had once lived in fear of a faceless predator now saw the man responsible, sitting silently in the courtroom. The survivors were given a chance to share their stories, their voices unwavering as they recounted the events that had haunted them for years. Many spoke directly to DeAngelo, detailing the pain, fear, and trauma his actions had inflicted upon their lives. They described sleepless nights, relationships strained, and the impact of constantly living with the shadows he had cast. The court listened as witness after witness shared their accounts, stories that had once seemed lost to time. Each testimony was a powerful reminder of the lives that had been altered, of the families that had been torn apart. DeAngelo sat motionless, his expression unreadable, as each voice joined a chorus demanding accountability. Through their words, a portrait of resilience emerged, a testament to the strength of those who had survived his violence. In the face of overwhelming evidence, DeAngelo eventually admitted to his crimes, sparing the survivors a lengthy trial. Yet the sentencing hearings were no less powerful. Families of victims came forward, some clutching photos, others simply holding their memories close, and spoke of the lives that had been taken and the futures that had been stolen. They honored the loved ones who would never grow older, who had never had the chance to find peace, and expressed a grief that had long been held in silence. After each statement, the weight of their loss filled the courtroom. They stood not only for themselves, but for those who could no longer speak, making sure their memories would never be forgotten. DeAngelo, the man who had once seemed unstoppable, was now at the mercy of the very people he had terrorized. His actions had left an indelible mark, but his power over them had finally been broken. In the end, Joseph James DeAngelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence brought a sense of finality, though the scars left by his crimes would linger. Survivors and families took comfort in knowing that the man responsible was finally behind bars, that he would live the rest of his days confined and unable to harm anyone again. For California, and for those whose lives had been intertwined with his violence, DeAngelo's capture marked a turning point. Law enforcement agencies across the state had faced one of the longest, most grueling pursuits in their history, and while the cost had been high, their perseverance had led to justice. Advances in forensic science had unlocked the mystery that had kept DeAngelo hidden for so long, revealing the power of persistence even after decades. The communities he had terrorized began to heal, though the impact of his actions would be felt for years to come. Families, survivors, and detectives were left with the memories of the search, the fear, and finally, the relief. The Golden State Killer was now a part of history, his crimes recorded, his freedom taken away. The shadow that had loomed over California for decades had lifted, and those he had affected could begin to reclaim their lives, united by a shared strength that would endure. The next story is called The Secrets of the Zodiac Letters. In the darkened world of 1960s California, a single figure emerged, intent on seizing the headlines and instilling a deep-rooted fear that would linger for decades. The Zodiac Killer, a name that would become synonymous with terror, with letters that spoke of unspeakable acts, and a mind that seemed to play games with law enforcement and the public alike. The first communication was sent in July 1969, igniting a chilling dialogue with the public, law enforcement, and the media that no one would soon forget. In these initial letters, the Zodiac laid out his crimes with disturbing calm, offering detailed accounts that confirmed his connection to a string of murders in the Bay Area. He introduced himself with an unsettling sense of pride, claiming responsibility for the attacks, and, in a sinister twist, challenged anyone who dared to understand him. Within his words lay cryptic symbols, codes that he boasted would lead to his identity, if only someone could solve them. This wasn't a mere confession. It was a declaration of a disturbing game, one with deadly consequences if authorities failed to keep up. Imagine the newsroom as the first letter arrived. Editors and reporters huddled around, their faces pale as they read the words of a killer who seemed as calculated as he was merciless. The newspapers struggled with an ethical dilemma. Should they publish the letter and risk encouraging further violence, or should they keep it hidden, potentially aggravating an already unpredictable criminal? The Zodiac made the decision easier with a dire threat. If his words weren't printed on the front page, he would kill again, this time with no restraint. And so, reluctantly, they published the letter. In an instant, every reader in California was thrown into the Zodiac's web, captivated by his audacity and fearful of what he would do next. But there was more. The Zodiac didn't only send letters, he sent 3 cryptograms along with them, each one made up of a series of odd symbols and letters that formed a puzzling, almost taunting barrier between him and the truth. He claimed these symbols held the key to understanding his identity and motive, a hint that drove codebreakers and cryptography enthusiasts into a frenzy. The coded messages were printed, and suddenly the public, local law enforcement, and even national agencies had their eyes glued to this bizarre puzzle, all hoping to crack the cipher that could lead to his capture. The codes seemed deceptively simple at first, but as experts pored over them, it became clear that they were crafted with careful precision. The Zodiac was, perhaps, as brilliant as he was dangerous. Amateur codebreakers, cryptography specialists, and even teams from the FBI joined the effort, their minds consumed by the challenge. Newspapers reported on their progress, or rather, their lack of it. Each passing day that the codes remained unsolved was another day that the Zodiac held a sinister upper hand, basking in the knowledge that he had outsmarted them all. Through each letter, the Zodiac's tone shifted between calculated threat and almost arrogant amusement. He seemed to take pleasure in the chase, savoring each moment that he kept the public and the police guessing. His words gave glimpses into a mind that saw murder not only as an act of violence, but as a form of twisted art, something to be carefully orchestrated and then proudly displayed. With each new letter, the sense of dread in the community grew. People in the Bay Area began to fear the night, the darkened parks, and even quiet suburban streets. Law enforcement officials were thrown into one of the largest manhunts in California's history, but they faced an invisible enemy. Despite heightened patrols and more rigorous investigations, Zodiac remained elusive, slipping through their fingers at every turn. As the police struggled to get ahead of the killer, he reveled in his freedom, knowing his pursuers were unable to keep up. He painted a chilling picture in his letters, not just of his crimes, but of a mind that believed it was destined to take lives. He boasted of collecting souls, as if each life he took was a grim tally in a twisted game. It wasn't enough for him to commit murder. He wanted his victims and the world to understand the depth of his power and control. Even as the months passed, the Zodiac showed no sign of stopping. In one particularly unsettling letter, he claimed he would begin targeting school buses, threatening to pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. It was a line that sent shockwaves through parents and schools, leading to an outpouring of fear and a mobilization of resources to protect children. Police cars began tailing school buses, patrols were ramped up, and communities found themselves trapped in a collective state of terror, unable to trust that their loved ones were safe. The Zodiac Killer seemed to take pleasure in the chaos he caused, knowing that his threats alone could make an entire city shake with fear. To him, fear was another weapon, one he wielded with the same precision as his cryptic symbols and darkly worded letters. As investigators and codebreakers continued to work around the clock, the Zodiac's twisted game became even more intricate. The letters poured in sporadically, each one more provocative than the last, with the killer hinting at new crimes, or worse, unthinkable plans to unleash violence in unexpected places. Alongside these threats, Zodiac embedded yet another layer of mystery, codes that would take seasoned cryptographers weeks, even months, to decipher. The first code had finally been cracked by a married couple with a shared interest in puzzles. This cipher, though rough and riddled with errors, offered disturbing insight. It spoke of the thrill the Zodiac felt during his crimes, a dark pleasure in the control he exerted over his victims. Yet, tellingly, the killer withheld his identity even here, choosing instead to drape himself in the secrecy that so captivated the public. This breakthrough had led some to believe that they were closing in on him, but each decoded cipher seemed to only open a new door into the depths of Zodiac's twisted mind. He had fashioned himself into a near mythological figure, one who evaded capture and toyed with those who sought him, keeping his identity buried beneath layers of coded language and cryptic clues. By the early 1970s, law enforcement realized the magnitude of what they were up against. This was no ordinary case, nor a typical suspect. The Zodiac had studied their methods and anticipated their every move, leaving false trails and sending letters just as public anxiety began to wane. In response, local police departments collaborated more closely with federal agencies, pooling resources and sharing every shred of evidence in a desperate attempt to get one step ahead. But no matter how many officers, codebreakers, and detectives joined the hunt, the Zodiac was always one move ahead. In his later letters, the Zodiac's taunts took on an almost boastful tone. He relished the media coverage, seemingly pleased with the influence he held over public fear. He went so far as to complain about the way his letters were printed, critiquing the typesetting and berating editors who, in his opinion, had misrepresented his words. These messages revealed a mind obsessed with control, not only over his victims, but over his public persona. The Zodiac wanted to ensure that his legacy would be preserved exactly as he envisioned it. Over time, amateur codebreakers, often inspired by the initial success of the first cipher solution, pored over every letter with zeal, eager to make a breakthrough that might unravel the mystery. They met in small groups, swapped theories, and dug through cryptography manuals, hoping for some insight that the professionals might have overlooked. Some of them became famous in their own right for their work on the Zodiac case, giving interviews and discussing theories on television. But even the most promising interpretations only seemed to scratch the surface of the Zodiac's true nature. To the public, each failed attempt at identifying the killer only added to the fear and fascination surrounding him. People whispered about potential suspects in their towns and swapped stories of strange encounters that might have been close brushes with the Zodiac himself. Reports of suspicious characters spiked, with townspeople calling in to report anyone who looked remotely like the police sketch. Yet, these leads went nowhere, as the Zodiac's identity remained as elusive as ever. And still, the Zodiac continued to send his letters. With each one, he reasserted his presence, dropping hints about his personal beliefs, his disdain for authority, and his chilling detachment from the suffering he caused. He referred to himself as a hunter, reveling in the way he preyed on those who were unsuspecting, unprepared. He even began signing his letters with a symbol resembling a crosshair, as though to suggest he had marked each of his victims in advance. His writing, laced with casual cruelty and dark humor, suggested a person who thrived on the attention his crimes brought. The crosshair became his mark, a symbol that came to represent not only his ability to evade capture, but his power to paralyze a community with fear. Every time a new letter appeared, the crosshair at the bottom of the page was a haunting reminder that he was still out there, still watching, and still deciding his next move. The symbol, simple yet ominous, became almost as infamous as the man himself. As the years wore on, each attempt to decode his letters and pinpoint his identity became more urgent. The Zodiac remained silent for longer periods, leading the public and investigators alike to wonder if he had grown bored of his game, or if he was simply waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. It was a race against time, with law enforcement tirelessly searching for answers, while knowing that each passing day meant he was further from their grasp. Decades later, when a fresh wave of interest in the case surged, people wondered if new technology might finally close in on him. Would forensics now bring an end to the Zodiac's reign? For those who had spent years, even lifetimes, trying to understand the mind behind the crosshair, the hope was that, even in his silence, they might finally find a clue hidden in his words, a slip in his calculations, or a trace of his presence that would reveal who he truly was. But, as had always been the case with the Zodiac, certainty remained just out of reach, his twisted puzzle refusing to give up its secrets. And as the story of this relentless, unidentified figure unfolded, the world waited, watching for any sign that the Zodiac might make himself known once more. As the Zodiac's letters continued to arrive, each message seemed more chilling than the last. The killer's language evolved from cryptic and playful to an openly dark and aggressive tone, punctuated by brazen threats and even promises of future violence. The Zodiac appeared to thrive on the control he held over his audience. Not only the police and media, but an entire region now captivated and fearful. In each letter, the Zodiac toyed with his readers, feeding them just enough detail to stoke interest without ever fully revealing himself. The letters painted the picture of a calculated individual who not only had knowledge of the Bay Area, but seemed intimately familiar with the movements of the police. Investigators began to wonder if this killer was someone from within their own ranks or someone with access to their tactics. The Zodiac's communications hinted at knowledge of investigative methods and procedures. He knew how long it would take for officers to arrive at a crime scene, how witnesses could be manipulated, and how to avoid leaving meaningful evidence behind. His letters became a taunt, suggesting he could strike anywhere, anytime, and the police would always be 2 steps behind. In one letter, the Zodiac provided details about his encounters that had not been shared publicly, a clear demonstration of his first-hand involvement in the crimes he claimed. He used these details as leverage, proof that he was indeed the person behind the violence that had shocked the community. He seemed to enjoy describing how he observed his victims, how he approached them, and how he chose the exact moment to confront them. To the public, these descriptions were terrifyingly intimate, as though the killer could be watching them too, analyzing and calculating from afar. The Zodiac's letters soon introduced a new twist. He began issuing puzzles that, according to him, contained the secrets of his identity and his motive. The codes he crafted were complex and seemed intentionally misleading, pushing codebreakers to their limits. But, to the Zodiac, the struggle seemed to be the entire point. Well, this wasn't about solving a mystery. It was about watching others attempt to do so, knowing that the answer lay beyond their reach. To unravel these puzzles, cryptographers of every stripe joined the effort, everyone from amateur puzzle solvers to elite mathematicians, all hoping to crack the Zodiac's code. Some of the most brilliant minds of the time took up the challenge, driven by a fascination with the killer's mind and the belief that somewhere in these ciphers lay the key to ending his reign. But the Zodiac had anticipated their moves, crafting codes that would entangle even the most seasoned experts. Meanwhile, psychological profiles of the Zodiac Killer started to emerge, drawn from his writings and patterns. Psychologists suggested he might have a background in military or technical fields, perhaps even as someone familiar with encrypted communication. They theorized that he was someone who craved not only power, but the feeling of intellectual superiority, someone who reveled in the idea that he could outsmart an entire community of detectives, specialists, and everyday citizens. The Zodiac wanted to be seen not only as a fearsome figure, but as an intelligent and unreachable one. As the analysis continued, authorities began exploring various leads, each one seemingly more plausible than the last. Suspects emerged, men with strange histories, criminal records, and connections to the places the Zodiac haunted. The police sketched profiles and compared handwriting samples, interviewed witnesses, and scrutinized alibis, only to find that each suspect seemed to drift just beyond reach. Each time a lead looked promising, it slipped through their fingers, leaving them with no closer grasp on the elusive identity of the Zodiac. Adding to the frustration, the Zodiac began to make statements that implied he was watching the investigators' every move. In one letter, he ridiculed police efforts, hinting that he knew the exact methods they were using to track him. He mocked them, saying he could walk through the streets and remain invisible while they scoured the wrong leads. To him, the efforts of the police and the public were nothing more than a game, one he was determined to win. The police, in turn, grew more determined. Their work extended well beyond standard shifts as they pored over files, notes, and crime scene photos. Law enforcement across counties worked tirelessly, driven by the idea that a mistake or a missed detail might hold the answer they desperately sought. Days turned into nights in cramped offices, where exhausted officers pored over leads and tips from anxious residents. Everyone was looking for the thread that would finally unravel the Zodiac's seemingly endless riddle. Despite the Zodiac's hold over the community, people began to resist his grip on their lives. A sense of defiance grew among residents as they faced down the terror that the Zodiac had tried to spread. Local newspapers continued publishing, and people continued to live their lives, although with a heightened awareness of their surroundings. In an ironic twist, the Zodiac's very presence had brought communities closer together as neighbors checked in on each other, and local organizations hosted gatherings to support one another. The Zodiac may have cast a long shadow, but he couldn't destroy the spirit of a region that refused to live in perpetual fear. Yet, the Zodiac never allowed the community to forget him for long. In his final letters, he hinted at crimes he might commit or even claimed to have already committed them, with chilling details that left both law enforcement and the public in constant anticipation of his next move. The possibility of his return hovered like a storm, casting an inescapable tension over the Bay Area. As the Zodiac Killer letters dwindled, an eerie silence replaced the once steady stream of threats. Weeks turned into months, and the absence of new letters left both investigators and the public in a state of uneasy suspense. Had the Zodiac disappeared, moved on, or perhaps was he simply biding his time? These unanswered questions haunted the investigators who had worked relentlessly on the case, unwilling to accept that their prime suspect could simply vanish. The absence of new letters led many to speculate that he had left the Bay Area, or worse, that he might have found new ways to continue his grim pursuits elsewhere, undetected. In the 1990s, decades after the initial flurry of letters, the Zodiac case experienced a resurgence. Advances in forensic science sparked new hope as DNA testing, fingerprint analysis, and database technology improved drastically. Cold case units around the country were revisiting unsolved cases, and the Zodiac files, filled with letters, codes, and cryptic evidence, became a prime candidate for re-investigation. The question of whether modern technology could succeed where the previous investigation had failed brought renewed vigor to law enforcement's search for answers. Investigators combed through the case files, hoping to uncover new evidence that could withstand today's forensic scrutiny. Handwriting samples were re-evaluated under more precise analysis techniques, and latent fingerprints on the letters were compared to modern databases in search of a match. However, this was no straightforward task. The Zodiac's letters were old, and the materials had degraded over time, complicating efforts to extract any viable DNA or trace evidence that might reveal a link to the mysterious figure behind the crimes. The focus soon turned to the possibility that tiny, nearly invisible clues might be hidden within the Zodiac's letters themselves. Forensic examiners took a closer look, examining every crease, every microscopic stain, hoping to uncover something new. The Zodiac had never revealed much about his personal life, but perhaps his writing, under the scrutiny of modern forensics, would finally give up its secrets. Investigators began re-examining everything from the type of ink he used to the pressure patterns in his handwriting, hoping to glean insights into his state of mind, background, and identity. Public interest in the Zodiac Killer's case surged as true crime stories gained popularity in the media. Books, documentaries, and articles revisited every detail, reintroducing the Zodiac's story to a new generation. Amateur sleuths and professional investigators alike pored over the case, developing theories, revisiting the evidence, and debating who the Zodiac might have been. Online forums lit up with discussions, and armchair detectives attempted to piece together the case from every angle, determined to solve a mystery that had baffled professionals for decades. Despite the best efforts of modern detectives, the identity of the Zodiac Killer remained frustratingly out of reach. Yet, the enduring mystery became as much a part of his legacy as the crimes themselves. The Zodiac had managed to create an enigma that fascinated, horrified, and confounded people for generations. He had woven himself into the fabric of true crime history, a figure who eluded capture while leaving just enough evidence to keep people searching. The resurgence in interest brought forth new suspects, with investigators re-examining possible connections between the Zodiac and individuals who had evaded scrutiny during the original investigation. One such lead involved an individual who had lived near the crime scenes and displayed behaviors that matched some of the Zodiac's characteristics. This suspect had a history of violent tendencies and had been known to communicate in an unsettling, cryptic manner. Detectives reviewed records, interviewed acquaintances, and explored any potential links between this suspect and the Zodiac's letters, hoping this time they were finally on the right track. But as quickly as new leads surfaced, they seemed to evaporate. The Zodiac had covered his tracks meticulously, leaving no solid evidence behind. Many suspects who initially seemed promising turned out to have alibis, inconsistencies in their profiles, or simply lacked the connection to the case that would definitively link them to the Zodiac's crime. Investigators were once again left with the unsettling realization that they were pursuing a ghost, a figure who moved through the shadows and knew exactly how to stay hidden. The Zodiac Killer's mystique was bolstered by the culture that grew up around his crimes. Over time, he became an almost mythic figure, a symbol of the unknown that fascinated and disturbed the public. Stories of his crimes were retold, analyzed, and dramatized, embedding the Zodiac in popular culture. To some, he represented the ultimate criminal mind, a character who had defied not only the police, but the very structure of justice. To others, he was a reminder of the dangers that could lurk in ordinary places, the dark side of human nature that remained just beyond the reach of comprehension. Through each era, the Zodiac's case inspired new generations of investigators, both professional and amateur, who held out hope that he might one day be identified. He became a cautionary tale, a figure whose crimes had changed the way law enforcement approached cases involving taunting, elusive killers. Police departments across the country adopted new strategies to avoid similar cases, using the Zodiac investigation as a case study for dealing with perpetrators who thrived on public attention and notoriety. Even as time wore on, the Zodiac's silence held power. His case had grown cold, but it remained a chilling reminder that sometimes justice can feel achingly close, yet remain just out of reach. As detectives continued their work, they knew that the Zodiac might still be out there, watching, while his puzzle continued to evade resolution. As the years passed and new methods of investigation emerged, law enforcement and amateur sleuths alike clung to one hope: that someday advances in technology or a previously overlooked clue might finally unmask the Zodiac Killer. The rise of DNA profiling offered a tantalizing possibility. Could a stray fingerprint or a single microscopic piece of genetic material finally bring the elusive figure into the light? In recent years, forensic scientists worked on extracting DNA from the stamps and envelopes the Zodiac used. It was a challenging endeavor. The passage of time had degraded much of the material, and early investigative handling had contaminated some of the evidence. But as technology evolved, so did the precision of forensic techniques, and experts held out hope that even the smallest sample might yield results. DNA profiling was being used to solve cold cases, thought unsolvable, breathing new life into long-forgotten files. The application of forensic genealogy brought fresh momentum to the case. With this technique, investigators could compare DNA from the Zodiac's letters to the profiles of distant relatives in genealogical databases, hoping to narrow the field of suspects. This method had solved other notorious cold cases, identifying suspects after decades of mystery. The possibility that Zodiac's family tree might hold clues to his identity captivated the public once again, and even the most skeptical investigators couldn't help but feel a spark of optimism. For those who had dedicated their lives to the Zodiac investigation, the search was personal. Detectives who had once been young officers now looked back on a career defined by the hunt for a ghost. Some retired without ever knowing the answers they sought. Others passed on files and insights to younger colleagues, hoping the next generation would uncover the truth. The case was a legacy that haunted the departments and communities involved, reminding everyone that closure was still out of reach. Yet, with each passing year, the Zodiac Killer seemed to slip further into legend. As the case aged, a new wave of fascination emerged, fueled by those who saw the Zodiac not merely as a criminal to be caught, but as a figure to be analyzed and, in some unsettling cases, admired. Websites, forums, and books dedicated to dissecting the Zodiac's letters and his cryptic messages proliferated. In these spaces, people speculated about his identity, motives, and even his psychology, hoping to understand the mind behind the infamous crosshair symbol. The Zodiac story began to take on a life of its own. To some, he was more than a criminal. He was a challenge, a figure whose intelligence and planning defied the world's best detectives. This fascination gave rise to countless theories, some grounded in evidence, others in pure speculation. Was he an average person with an extraordinary mind? A former military operative skilled in evasion? Or was he simply a local, blending into the backdrop of everyday life, watching the search for him unfold? In the end, the Zodiac case stood as both a tragedy and a mystery, a series of lives cut short, and a story that refused to end. For each family touched by his actions, there was the haunting reality of a life taken, and a criminal who walked away. These families bore the burden of loss and the lingering absence of justice, while the world speculated, debated, and theorized. The Zodiac's shadow extended beyond his own time, leaving a legacy that changed the landscape of law enforcement. His taunts to police, his codes, and his ability to evade capture led to profound shifts in the way agencies handle serial crime investigations. His letters and threats gave rise to a new awareness of the power that public attention can give to a criminal. The police and the public learned that to engage with such a figure came at a cost, one that left a deep imprint on the culture of law enforcement. In a final, bitter irony, the Zodiac Killer's story remains one of the few cold cases that persist in the public eye. He may have faded from active investigation, but he never truly left. His letters, his symbols, and his cryptic codes continue to captivate, to haunt, and to challenge those who long to understand him. For every person who reads his letters, for every investigator who sifts through the files, and for every family affected by his actions, the Zodiac remains an unsettling reminder of a mystery, unresolved, a riddle that lingers, a figure as elusive today as he was half a century ago. As the case file continues to gather dust, its pages hold a story of fear, fascination, and the dark unknown, an enigma that has woven itself into history, with questions that linger unanswered, still waiting for the day when one final clue might bring light to the mystery of the Zodiac Killer. The next and final story is called The Grim Sleeper. On a warm night in 2007, the bustling streets of south-central Los Angeles seemed as they always did, quiet in some corners, restless in others, with people going about their lives in the dim glow of streetlights. Yet, hidden in the shadowy alleys and empty lots of this sprawling city, something far more unsettling was lurking, a secret that had haunted the area for years but remained unseen. That night, police officers responded to a report that would haunt even the most seasoned detectives. When they arrived at the scene, they found the body of a young woman in an alleyway, carefully concealed. She was laid out, as if by someone who'd taken the time to arrange her, a disturbing indication that whoever did this felt no rush or fear of being caught. The officers stood in silence, absorbing the gravity of the scene. It was as though the lifeless body was speaking in some hidden language, pleading with them to uncover what had happened. The victim was quickly identified as a local woman known for her quiet demeanor, someone who'd kept largely to herself. She had friends, family, a whole life behind her, but here in this alley, her story took a devastating turn. The detectives were disturbed not only by the brutality of the scene, but by the calculated nature of it. Whoever was behind this had shown skill, patience, and, chillingly, a sense of purpose. As the days passed, the city tried to move on, but whispers of fear spread through the streets. This was no isolated incident. When the investigation continued, detectives found themselves facing an eerie pattern. Cases stretching back decades with chillingly similar details. Bodies discovered in alleyways and deserted spots, each with signs of having been targeted by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. For years, these cases had slipped through the cracks, dismissed as unrelated or lost in the chaos of urban crime. But now, with this latest discovery, those forgotten cases were being resurrected, one haunting detail at a time. The detectives were relentless, piecing together what they could from the thin strands of evidence. It was a thankless job, grueling and filled with setbacks, but they pressed on. The team combed through files, reports, and photographs, determined to find any link that could provide answers. And slowly, they began to see the outline of a figure, a shadow that had slipped unnoticed through the city's underbelly for far too long. They called him the Grim Sleeper, a name that would soon be whispered across neighborhoods and reported in every paper. A figure who had lurked in plain sight, striking without warning, then vanishing back into the night as if he never existed. For those who lived in South Central, life was irrevocably changed. The discovery of a serial offender terrorizing their community reignited fears that had simmered for years. Friends and neighbors whispered about loved ones who had disappeared, victims whose cases remained unsolved, and mothers who had waited decades for answers. The Grim Sleeper had become more than a shadowy figure. He was now the embodiment of dread, a haunting presence that loomed over every dark street and abandoned alley. As more bodies were discovered, so too did the pressure grow on the police. Detectives became haunted by the faces in the files they studied late into the night, each one a life cut short, each one carrying a story that had ended in horror. Each detail revealed another layer to the mystery, another reason to keep pushing, even as hope dimmed with every dead end. They pored over evidence, from fibers and fingerprints to grainy surveillance footage, piecing together what little they could find. Yet, the Grim Sleeper's calculated precision made him elusive, a ghost in a labyrinth of evidence that led nowhere. But detectives knew that even the most careful offenders make mistakes, and that relentless pursuit could eventually corner even the most skilled. So, they kept digging, hoping for the break that would bring this specter into the light, and finally offer peace to the families who had waited too long for justice. As the investigation continued, whispers of fear had turned into tense conversations on street corners and in living rooms throughout South Central Los Angeles. Residents were on edge, many glancing over their shoulders as if at any moment, the Grim Sleeper might emerge from the shadows. The police had begun piecing together a chilling pattern, one that suggested a methodical, deliberate predator who had haunted the city undetected for years. The eerie calm that settled after each attack was even more unsettling. He seemed to retreat into his life, lying low as though the crimes had never happened. And when he reappeared, it was always with the same calculated cruelty. To the detectives on the case, this pattern was a race against time. They saw how meticulously he chose his victims, how he took pains to hide his actions, leaving only faint traces of his dark intent. Detectives pored over crime scene photos and cold case files, uncovering new connections each day, each piece hinting at an elaborate puzzle they struggled to solve. The oldest cases, filed away and nearly forgotten, now had fresh importance. Every new detail magnified the urgency of their mission to stop him, yet he remained maddeningly elusive, slipping back into everyday life like a phantom. Detective Herman, one of the lead investigators, spent sleepless nights piecing together the evidence. The toll was evident in his worn expression and the growing bags under his eyes. His team was relentless, combing through every case in the area that fit the sleeper's brutal signature. Long hours were spent linking the faint clues he'd left behind, even tracing small details, like the unique manner in which he approached his victims. Detective Herman became consumed by the hunt, driven by the voices of families who had suffered for years without answers. The community's despair fueled their work, each step of the investigation deepening their understanding of the Grim Sleeper's twisted mind. It was this insight that led them to uncover the identity of several survivors, women who had lived through encounters with this figure, barely escaping with their lives. Their testimonies painted a horrific picture. A man who lurked on the fringes of society, seemingly ordinary by day, but driven by something darker when the sun went down. In their words, Detectives sensed the cold detachment of a man who viewed his actions without remorse, a man who had slipped unnoticed through the streets. In their search for answers, detectives struggled with the realization that this was no average criminal. The grim sleeper's acts were more than crimes. They were a twisted ritual, each one meticulously planned and executed. The survivors' stories, raw and painful, left the detectives with the unsettling awareness that they were dealing with someone who thrived on fear, someone who found satisfaction in the hunt itself. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of the case bore down on the entire task force. They encountered leads that seemed promising only to dissolve into nothing, leaving them stranded in a maze of unanswered questions. Surveillance cameras, witness statements, even forensic evidence all pointed to dead ends. Frustration set in, yet they pressed on, knowing that the moment they stopped, he would strike again. And then, almost miraculously, a breakthrough surfaced. A single piece of evidence, nail left on one of the victims years before, had been recovered and meticulously preserved. It was faint, nearly destroyed with time, but it was enough. This sliver of DNA held the potential to lead them directly to him. With technology advancements, the team was able to analyze it, running it against a massive database that could potentially match it to a suspect. Every step felt monumental. The tension in the room was electric as detectives waited for the results, knowing that this could be the final piece of the puzzle they had so desperately sought. The results returned swiftly, and with them a name emerged: Lonnie David Franklin Jr. It was a shock to see such an ordinary name, but the detectives quickly learned that nothing about Lonnie Franklin's life had ever hinted at the darkness he harbored within. A local resident, he had lived in the same neighborhood where the crimes had occurred, blending seamlessly into the community. He had friends, a family, a reputation as a quiet, friendly man. To those who knew him, he was a mechanic, a man who loved fixing cars and enjoyed a good laugh with neighbors. To detectives, he was now a person of intense interest, a suspect who had operated undetected and under a veil of normalcy. Detectives moved swiftly, orchestrating a covert operation to observe him, carefully watching his movements, learning his habits, and seeking further evidence to confirm their suspicions. For days, they trailed Franklin, noting his interactions, his routines, and the subtle cues that now painted him in a far more sinister light. What disturbed them most was how utterly unremarkable he seemed. He was the type who'd fade into the background, precisely the kind of person one might easily overlook, a fact he had used to his advantage. Then, as though by fate, detectives captured a vital piece of evidence, a discarded item that held Franklin's DNA. It was a perfect match, connecting him to the series of crimes with chilling certainty. The task force erupted in cautious relief. They had finally found him. Yet this relief was tinged with dread as they braced themselves to confront a man who had lived undetected among them. A man who had likely relished every moment of his dark journey, hiding in plain sight. It was now time to act. With this evidence in hand, they prepared for the arrest, gathering their forces and briefing their teams on what lay ahead. The neighborhood remained unaware of the man who had walked among them all these years, who had blended in so seamlessly that his neighbors could hardly believe the news. The detectives moved in, ready to bring to an end the story of the grim sleeper, a story that had haunted their city, cast a shadow over their lives, and left scars that would last for generations. The morning of Lonnie Franklin's arrest was cloaked in silence, a tense calm that hung over the police operation. Undercover officers were stationed nearby, waiting for the signal to converge on Franklin's home. Detectives prepared themselves for any resistance, knowing that confronting a man with such a grim history could lead to anything. But when the time came, Franklin was calm. His demeanor was disturbingly composed, almost as though he had been expecting them. The officers placed him in custody without incident, a stark contrast to the horrors he had left in his wake. As Franklin was escorted to the precinct, detectives entered his home, expecting to find evidence, but they were unprepared for the disturbing reality within. What they uncovered would haunt them long after the case was closed. Tucked away in drawers, stashed behind furniture, and hidden throughout the home were photographs of women, many of whom bore the same haunted look as the victims they had so painstakingly identified over the years. The detectives could hardly believe their eyes. They combed through these images with mounting horror, realizing they were looking at faces of those who had been part of Franklin's hidden world. Some were known victims, others had never even been reported missing, their existence lost in a sea of anonymity until now. This discovery painted a chilling portrait of Franklin's life, one he had carefully constructed to keep his two worlds separate. His public face of a genial neighbor, an everyday mechanic, a family man, was so unremarkable that it provided him with the perfect cover. But these images, frozen moments in time, revealed a different truth. The world he inhabited in secret was one filled with darkness. Detectives pored over every photograph, cataloging each face, determined to give names to those who had remained nameless for so long. The task force worked tirelessly, piecing together these fragments of lives and cross-referencing the images with cold case files. Hours turned into days as they analyzed every detail, connecting Franklin to multiple unsolved cases. And as more information surfaced, Franklin's history as the grim sleeper became painfully clear. He had operated in a cruel, calculated way, appearing in the community between attacks with an unsettling nonchalance, as though he could simply shed the weight of his crimes and blend back into society. Each time he re-emerged, he was a father, a husband, a friend to neighbors who never suspected the depths of his darkness. The detectives were haunted by his calm in the face of everything, especially as he sat in the interrogation room. They had come to expect a reaction, a sign of guilt or defiance, but Franklin gave none. He was impenetrable, sitting quietly as they questioned him. Even when presented with evidence, Franklin maintained a chilling silence, his expression almost unreadable. His lack of remorse was something that weighed heavily on the officers in the room. It wasn't that he was indifferent to their questions, it was that he seemed beyond even that. To him, the lives he had touched, the suffering he had inflicted, appeared to mean nothing. As they pressed on, detectives realized that Franklin's silence was part of his control. He enjoyed watching their frustration, finding some measure of satisfaction in holding the truth back from them. The investigators found themselves face to face with a man who held no empathy, a person who saw the world as a stage for his own satisfaction. For Franklin, the secrecy, the hidden lives, the images he had kept stashed away, were as much a part of his identity as his daily routine. It was as though he was two men in one, shifting between these personas with a chilling ease that defied understanding. Meanwhile, the media quickly latched onto the case, and Franklin's arrest sent shockwaves through Los Angeles. Residents of South Central, many of whom had crossed paths with him, were in disbelief. Franklin had lived among them, shared their streets, and even offered help to some, all while hiding unimaginable secrets. His friends, colleagues, and even his family struggled to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the truth. The weight of betrayal hung over the city, casting a dark shadow as more was revealed. Detectives pored through Franklin's life, searching for any hints in his past, any signs they might have missed. They spoke with people who had known him, those who had crossed paths with him over the years. But the portrait they painted of Lonnie Franklin remained unnervingly ordinary. He had been the man who worked on neighbors' cars, offered a helping hand, and even chatted with local shop owners. Yet, hidden beneath that friendly exterior was the mind of a man who operated without compassion, a person who had chosen his victims as though they were simply objects in his path. It was this dual nature that haunted the detectives, who saw in Franklin a darkness so deeply concealed that it had taken decades to unravel. As they prepared the case for trial, they knew it was no longer just about justice for the victims. It was about ensuring the city could finally exhale, knowing the shadow that had haunted their streets was finally behind bars. They braced themselves for the trials ahead, knowing they would have to confront the full weight of Franklin's actions, to stand before the world and reveal the face of a man who had evaded justice for so long. When Franklin's day in court arrived, the room was packed. Family members of victims, friends, members of the community, and press filled every seat, each person carrying their own questions, their own pain. As the prosecution laid out its case, recounting every horrific detail, a palpable tension filled the room. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies heartbreaking, and each new revelation struck the crowd like a wave. Franklin sat there through it all, unblinking, unmoved, a chilling reminder of how deeply hidden some shadows can be. The trial stretched on, each day peeling back more layers, showing a man who had kept his secrets for years, living side by side with those he deceived. As the testimonies of survivors echoed through the room, there was a powerful reminder of the strength it took for them to stand there, reliving their pain so that justice could finally be served. As the trial progressed, the evidence against Lonnie Franklin Jr. continued to mount. The prosecution laid out a chilling picture of a man who had lived a double life, hiding in plain sight while carrying out a series of unspeakable acts. Witness after witness took the stand, each adding pieces to the puzzle of who Franklin was and the horror he had left in his wake. Friends and neighbors expressed shock, some visibly shaken as they described a man they thought they knew, a man who had somehow managed to blend into the very community he had harmed. For the victims' families, each day in court was a painful reminder of their loved ones. They had spent years searching for answers, yearning for closure, only to find that the person responsible had been walking among them all along. As the prosecution detailed the methods Franklin had used to avoid detection, the families clutched photos and mementos, silent but resolute, their presence a testament to the lives that Franklin had forever altered. Among the most impactful testimonies were those from the survivors. One by one, these women stood before the court, their voices steady, but their words heavy with the weight of memory. They recounted encounters with Franklin, describing a man who had appeared trustworthy, approachable, and kind, a person they never would have suspected. It was that very sense of familiarity, they said, that had disarmed them. The prosecution underscored how Franklin had exploited that trust, using it to lure his victims into situations they could never have anticipated. The survivors' stories painted Franklin as calculating and unfeeling. They spoke of narrow escapes, moments that had haunted them for years, memories they had tried to bury but could never fully forget. In the courtroom, their bravery was evident as they faced the man who had altered their lives, their words a powerful reminder of the strength it took to confront a person who had taken so much from them. Each testimony made clear the profound impact of Franklin's actions, not only on those who had survived, but also on their families, friends, and communities. As the trial continued, detectives provided insights into Franklin's meticulous behavior, explaining how he had been able to evade detection for so long. His habits were calculated and deliberate, honed over decades of evading suspicion. He had selected his victims carefully, targeting those he believed would go unnoticed, and leaving behind only faint traces of evidence that took years to piece together. His apparent lack of empathy made the detectives' work all the more difficult, as they tried to understand the mind of a man who had inflicted such pain without hesitation. The prosecutors detailed Franklin's attempts to mask his actions. He had used seemingly ordinary objects to avoid leaving fingerprints, taken routes that were hard to track, and chosen secluded areas, all part of an intricate strategy to keep his two lives separate. Each new piece of evidence painted a darker picture of Franklin as someone who had built his world around secrecy. Detectives admitted that they had been stymied time and time again, frustrated by his elusive methods and the vast gaps in the evidence. But they also knew that every small detail they uncovered brought them one step closer to the truth, and it was that determination that had finally led them to his door. Perhaps most unsettling of all was the discovery of Franklin's personal collection, a series of photographs and belongings that had been hidden away, each item a silent testament to a life he had affected. These were not trophies, as some might assume, but rather pieces of a private archive that seemed to be for Franklin alone. Investigators found photos that captured moments frozen in time, faces that stared back at them, revealing lives that had been touched by his shadow. Many of these women were still unidentified, leaving the authorities with an uneasy sense that even more victims remained unaccounted for. The prosecutors used these photographs to underscore the scale of Franklin's actions, revealing him as a man who seemed to regard his actions with detachment, as if his victims were merely fleeting figures. Detectives who had worked the case admitted that the sheer volume of these images left them reeling, with each new face representing a life interrupted, each detail a reminder of the impact Franklin had inflicted over the year. They were determined to identify every person in those photos, to bring justice to those who had never been able to tell their stories. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Franklin's defense attempted to cast doubt, suggesting that the evidence was circumstantial, that the photos could be explained away, that the DNA had been collected years after the crimes and could have been compromised. They leaned heavily on the idea that Franklin was simply a man who had been unlucky enough to live in a neighborhood where crime was all too common. Yet as each piece of evidence was presented, it became clear that these defenses were growing weaker in the face of the truth. As the final days of the trial approached, the prosecution prepared their closing arguments, emphasizing the meticulous way Franklin had concealed his actions for decades. They asked the jury to consider not only the evidence, but the impact on the families, the survivors, and the entire community that had been touched by his actions. They painted a picture of a man who had used his ordinary life as a shield, hiding behind the facade of normalcy while leaving a trail of broken lives. In those closing moments, the courtroom was silent, the weight of the case hanging heavy in the air. Family members of victims sat with tears in their eyes, clutching each other's hands, united by the pain they shared and the hope that justice would finally be served. As the jury filed back into the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The families of the victims and the survivors sat tensely, their faces a blend of grief and hope, awaiting the verdict that would determine whether their long journey for justice had reached its end. After weeks of gut-wrenching testimony and overwhelming evidence, the jury had finally reached a decision. The judge read the verdict: guilty. A collective breath seemed to release from the room, a mixture of relief, sadness, and closure. For the families, the ruling brought a sense of justice, but it was a bittersweet moment. No sentence could undo what had happened, nor could it erase the years of pain and loss they had endured. Yet, there was solace in knowing that the man responsible would no longer be able to walk freely, hidden among them. In the days following the verdict, the city of Los Angeles reflected on the scars left behind by Franklin's actions. South Central, a community that had been his hunting ground for decades, now faced the task of healing. Vigil services were held, flowers were placed in quiet alleyways, and the names of the victims were spoken with reverence, finally free from the shadows. Though Franklin's actions had left an indelible mark on the city, there was a newfound determination to remember the victims for who they were rather than the manner in which they had been taken. For the survivors who had bravely come forward, the verdict offered a measure of peace. Many of them had spent years wrestling with the trauma of their encounters with Franklin, their lives permanently altered. The ruling was more than just a legal decision. It was a public acknowledgement of their courage, a validation of their resilience in the face of unspeakable pain. In their own ways, they found paths forward, carrying with them memories of those they had lost, but refusing to let those memories be tainted by Franklin's legacy. The detectives who had worked tirelessly on the case felt a weight lifted. For years, they had been haunted by the faces of those they could not save, driven by the knowledge that someone so dangerous had remained among them for far too long. The closure that the verdict brought was as much theirs as it was the victims and their families. They, too, found solace in knowing that Franklin would never again pose a threat to the community they had sworn to protect. In the wake of the trial, law enforcement took steps to address the failings that had allowed Franklin to evade justice for so many years. Departments collaborated on improving case tracking systems, implementing new protocols to ensure that no case could slip through the cracks as so many had before. The story of the Grim Sleeper served as a powerful reminder of the importance of vigilance, compassion, and community, a lesson that stretched far beyond the courtroom. For the families of the victims, however, moving forward meant finding ways to honor their loved ones, to keep their memories alive. They held gatherings in their honor, shared stories, and created foundations to support others affected by similar losses. It was their way of transforming the darkness left by Franklin's actions into something meaningful, something that could offer hope to others. The tragedy they had endured was part of their lives now, but it no longer defined them. They chose to carry forward the joy, love, and kindness of those they had lost, refusing to let the story end with Franklin's cruelty. As time passed, the name of the Grim Sleeper faded from headlines, but the lessons of the case remained. For Los Angeles, the community's resilience stood as a testament to its strength. Neighbors looked out for one another, inspired by the unity that had arisen in the wake of the ordeal. It was a quiet, unspoken promise shared among them, a commitment to remember, to protect, and to continue building a community where compassion triumphed over fear. Franklin's case left a mark on the city, a mark that served as both a reminder and a warning. But more importantly, it underscored the resilience of those who had suffered, those who had stood up to reclaim their voices, and those who had fought to ensure that no shadow could ever again hide such darkness. If you enjoyed today's stories and want to hear more about the strange, dark, and mysterious, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Chill Thrills Stories. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss one of our daily uploads. We'd love to hear your thoughts or theories about today's stories, so drop a comment below. Thank you for watching Chill Thrills Stories, and we'll see you in the next one. Stay curious and stay safe.